Hannibal Barca, a shadow that looms over history, appears as a menacing storm in the collective consciousness of Rome, a fear that tears at the hearts of Romans with every mention of his name. This was a man whose might and cunning brought the Roman Republic to the brink of the abyss, his influence still as palpable today as it was more than 2 millennia ago. We must go back in the thread of time to 247 BC, where the ancient North African city of Carthage stands as a powerhouse at its peak. In the bosom of the flourishing Punic civilization, the destiny of a newborn child is already marked by the dreams and promises of his father. His name is Hannibal Barca, whose name bears the blessing of Baal, the chief god of Carthage, and translates as the grace of Baal. Raised in the shadow of his father, Hannibal Barca, a Carthaginian general of great reputation and a hero of the First Punic War, Hannibal was initiated from an early age into the ways of war. According to the chronicles of the historian Polybius, even as a boy of only 9 years old, Hannibal swore in the temple of Baal that he would be an eternal enemy of Rome, a commitment he would take with fervor until the end of his days. Educated not only in physical discipline and military tactics, Hannibal was also trained in the liberal arts, learning Greek and acquiring a deep understanding of diplomacy and administration, skills that would be vital to his future leadership. His preparation was carefully orchestrated to form not just a warrior, but a leader capable of carrying out the monumental task of challenging the growing power of the Roman Republic. The loss of his father, Hamilcar, during a campaign in Hispania in 228 BC, became the catalyst for Hannibal's determination. Hamilcar's death in battle was a blow to Carthage and a personal wound to Hannibal, who inherited not only his father's position as leader but also his desire for resistance against Rome. In Hannibal, virtues of endurance, strategic ingenuity, and an ability to motivate and unite the diverse tribes and cultures under his command were cultivated. But beyond these qualities, the young Hannibal carried with him an incandescent passion, a mixture of love for his homeland and a deep-seated grudge against Rome, which would lead him to challenge the supremacy of the Republic in the theater of war in the years to come. In the figure of Hannibal, the fate of Carthage and Rome were inexorably intertwined, giving rise to one of the most memorable conflicts in ancient history. Under Hannibal's leadership, Carthage plunged headlong into the conflict that would become known as the Second Punic War, which lasted from 218 BC to 201 BC. This period of intense fighting and strategy between the two powers of the time has been extensively studied in military history, largely due to the exploits of Hannibal himself. In 218 BC, Hannibal began his campaign with a bold and unconventional move. Instead of taking the more direct coastal route, he decided to take his army across the Alps to attack Rome from northern Italy. This surprise move caught the Romans off guard and gave the Carthaginians a valuable initial advantage. In 216 BC, Hannibal faced the Romans at the Battle of Canis, in what is considered one of the greatest military victories in history. Hannibal, despite being outnumbered, implemented a brilliant tactic involving his troops in a crescent formation. As the Romans advanced, the Carthaginian line retreated in the center but kept the flanks strong, giving the illusion of a retreat. As the Roman forces moved into the formation, Hannibal's troops closed the circle, trapping them. This allowed the Carthaginian forces to surround and decimate the Roman army, resulting in a slaughter that left the Romans with devastating losses. Ancient chronicles recount that Roman casualty amounted to nearly 70,000, a staggering figure compared to the 6,000 Carthaginian losses. The impact of the battle was such that, according to the historian Livy, Rome wept for several months. This triumph over Rome cemented Hannibal's place as one of the most brilliant military strategists in history. But Canis was only one of the outstanding battles in which Hannibal demonstrated his tactical ingenuity. Before that, at the Battle of the Trebia River and the Battle of Lake Trasimene, he had also demonstrated his ability to outmaneuver Roman generals and win despite being outnumbered. In the autumn of 218 BC, Hannibal Barca embarked on what would be one of the most daring military feats in history, crossing the Alps to launch a surprise assault on the very homeland of the Roman Republic. With an army of approximately 50,000 men, including infantry, cavalry, and a dozen war elephants, Hannibal began his march from Hispania, crossing southern Gaul and engaging local tribes in sporadic battles to secure his passage. His objective, the intimidating Alps, a natural barrier that many considered insurmountable for an army of such size. The adversities were many and varied: the wear and tear of long marches and combat, the cold and volatile weather, the steep and slippery terrain, the constant attack by alpine tribes, and the scarcity of supplies. Ancient historiography tells us that during the crossing of the Alps, Hannibal lost a large part of his army and most of his elephants. The casualties were due to starvation, disease, falls off cliffs, and clashes with alpine tribes. Nevertheless, despite the brutal conditions and losses, Hannibal managed to get his army across the Alps in just 16 days, emerging on the Po River plain in northern Italy. The Romans, who expected an attack from Carthage to come by sea, found themselves completely unprepared for this unprecedented maneuver. Hannibal's strategy of crossing the Alps had multiple objectives. In addition to taking the Romans by surprise, he also sought to avoid the powerful Roman navy that dominated the Mediterranean Sea. In addition, Hannibal hoped to ally himself with the tribes and cities of northern Italy that were dissatisfied with Roman rule, thus providing him with reinforcements and supplies. This bold and unexpected maneuver is one of the most outstanding examples of Hannibal's strategic astuteness. Despite the casualties and difficulties, his crossing of the Alps became a landmark that is still remembered today as one of the most impressive military feats in ancient history. His arrival in northern Italy marked the beginning of what would be a long and difficult confrontation with the Roman Republic, in which Hannibal would prove again and again his ability as a commander and strategist. Despite his initial success and crushing victories, Hannibal's dream of defeating Rome remained frustratingly out of reach. Although he had succeeded in terrorizing the Eternal City and had brought it to the brink of annihilation, he never managed to strike the final blow that would have tipped the balance of the war in Carthage's favor. The reason for this was largely due to Carthage's lack of reinforcements and supplies, which prevented it from effectively besieging Rome. Meanwhile, in Rome, a new leader was emerging. Publius Cornelius Scipio, who would later receive the nickname the African, was a young commander who had survived initial defeats at the hands of Hannibal and had learned from his tactics. Scipio recognized that to defeat Hannibal, Rome would have to change its tactics and strike Carthage directly. Thus, in 204 BC, Scipio launched an invasion of Africa, forcing Hannibal to withdraw from Italy to defend his homeland. 2 years later, in 202 BC, the forces of Hannibal and Scipio met at the Battle of Zama. The battle was fought on the plains near the city of Zama, in present-day Tunisia. Hannibal still had a sizable army, but he was devoid of the cavalry that had been crucial in his earlier victories. Scipio, on the other hand, had studied Hannibal's tactics and was ready to engage him. In battle, Scipio used a maneuver similar to the one Hannibal had employed at Canis, but with a twist. Instead of surrounding the enemy, he ordered his troops to open up and create corridors, which allowed the Roman cavalry, which had defeated Hannibal's cavalry on the flanks, to surround and attack the Carthaginian army from the rear. This maneuver resulted in a decisive defeat for Hannibal. With the defeat at Zama, Hannibal lost his last attempt to stop the Roman advance, and the fate of Carthage was sealed. The Second Punic War ended with the victory of Rome and the end of the Carthaginian threat. Scipio returned to Rome a hero, and Hannibal, despite his tactical brilliance and endurance, could not prevent the fall of his beloved Carthage at the hands of his eternal enemy, Rome. Hannibal lived his last days in exile, pursued by his enemies and abandoned by his allies. Finally, in 183 BC, faced with inevitable capture by his Roman pursuers, he chose death rather than dishonor. In a final act of defiance, he took his own life in Libya, denying Rome the satisfaction of his capture. Hannibal Barca, in life and death, became the personification of resistance against Rome, a permanent echo of a past in which a single figure nearly brought the greatest power of the ancient world to its knees.